The security cameras captured everything. Marcus Chen stood in the marble foyer of what used to be his parents' Beverly Hills mansion, holding the eviction notice that would change 3 lives forever. At 32, the software architect had never imagined he'd be the one to foreclose on the very house where he'd grown up feeling invisible. But when your own parents scream, "We hate you," and throw you out for refusing to bankroll their champagne lifestyle, sometimes you have to show them who really owns their million-dollar dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His mother's exact words still echoed in his mind from that terrible night 6 months ago. "You're nothing but a disappointment, Marcus. We should have stopped at your sister." What they didn't know was that their golden child had been secretly building an empire while they lived off his generosity, and when they finally pushed him too far, he was ready to show them exactly whose name was on every deed, every mortgage, and every investment that kept their world spinning. The Chen family mansion in Beverly Hills had always been a carefully constructed illusion, much like the family itself. From the outside, passersby would see the perfectly manicured Japanese garden, the circular driveway lined with luxury cars, and the 2-story colonial that screamed success. What they couldn't see was that every element of that success had been quietly, methodically purchased by the family's forgotten middle child. Marcus had learned early that love in the Chen household was conditional and hierarchical. His father, David Chen, was a former investment banker who had lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis, but maintained the facade of wealth through increasingly creative financing schemes. His mother, Linda, had once run a successful interior design firm, but now spent her days managing the family's social calendar and appearance. Then there was Jessica, 3 years younger than Marcus, whose striking beauty and natural charisma had made her the family's pride and joy since birth. Marcus remembered the exact moment he realized he was invisible to his own family. He was 14, standing in the living room with a certificate announcing his acceptance into MIT's summer program for gifted students. His parents were fussing over Jessica, who had just been crowned homecoming princess at her middle school. When Marcus tried to share his news, his father barely glanced up and said, "That's nice, son. Jessica, tell us more about the dress you'll wear to the dance." That night, alone in his room, Marcus made a promise to himself. If academic achievement wouldn't earn their attention, financial success would. He threw himself into computer science with the singular focus of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything to gain. While his classmates were playing video games, Marcus was teaching himself advanced programming languages. While they were at parties, he was building his first mobile applications. By 16, Marcus had earned more money from freelance coding projects than his father made in a year, though he never told anyone. He watched his parents struggle with mounting debts, saw the stress lines deepen around his mother's eyes when bills arrived, and made his first anonymous contribution to the family finances by paying off their credit card debt. The relief and joy on their faces when they thought they'd received an unexpected windfall was worth more to Marcus than any college acceptance letter. The pattern established itself quietly and insidiously over the years. Marcus would identify a financial pressure point in his family's life and eliminate it, always finding ways to make it seem like luck or good fortune rather than his intervention. When his father's consulting business failed, Marcus secretly bought out the company's debts and arranged for David to receive a generous severance package. When Jessica needed money for her expensive private arts college, Marcus created a scholarship fund specifically tailored to her profile. When his mother wanted to renovate the kitchen, Marcus arranged for her to win a home improvement contest she'd never entered. Each act of financial rescue was met with gratitude that lasted exactly as long as it took for the next crisis to emerge. Marcus began to understand that he wasn't solving problems. He was enabling a lifestyle that his parents had become addicted to maintaining. The more he gave, the more they expected, and the more invisible he became in the process. The transformation accelerated when Marcus landed his first major tech job at 25. His starting salary was more than both his parents had ever earned combined, and suddenly the family's financial problems seemed easily solvable. What started as helping with mortgage payments evolved into funding complete home renovations. Assistance with car payments became leases on luxury vehicles. Small contributions to Jessica's artistic pursuits grew into funding her entire lifestyle as she bounced between acting classes, yoga retreats, and various creative endeavors that never quite materialized into careers. Marcus found himself working 12-hour days at a demanding startup, living in a modest apartment in downtown Los Angeles, while his family enjoyed a lifestyle that would have been impossible without his silent subsidization. He told himself it was temporary, that eventually Jessica would establish her career, his parents would find their footing, and he could step back from being their financial safety net. The requests became more frequent and more specific. His mother needed money for a spa weekend to manage her stress. His father required funds to join an exclusive golf club for networking opportunities. Jessica needed immediate cash for headshots, acting coaches, and a new car because her old one didn't match her image as an emerging artist. Each request came with detailed explanations of why it was crucial for their success and happiness, and implicit suggestions that Marcus's refusal would be selfish and cruel. What hurt most was how his contributions were acknowledged. There were no family dinners celebrating his promotions, no proud phone calls when his innovations made tech industry headlines, no recognition when he was featured in business magazines as one of the city's rising entrepreneurs. Instead, there were casual thank you texts, brief mentions of his help during family gatherings, and the constant underlying assumption that supporting them was simply his role in the family ecosystem. Marcus's breaking point should have come earlier, but the human capacity for self-deception is remarkable. He convinced himself that his parents' lack of recognition was generational, that they expressed love differently, that his financial success was meaningless if he couldn't use it to help the people who mattered most. He told himself that Jessica's struggles were temporary, that his parents' financial irresponsibility was a product of their circumstances rather than their character. The first crack in his carefully constructed rationalization came during his 30th birthday celebration. Marcus had taken the family to an expensive restaurant in Malibu, intending to share news about his latest business venture, a software company he'd built from scratch that had just received its first major investment round. As he began to speak about his achievement, Jessica interrupted with news about a small role she'd landed in an independent film. The conversation immediately shifted to her career, her challenges, her dreams, and her needs for the upcoming production. Marcus sat quietly through dinner, listening to his parents shower Jessica with praise and attention for an unpaid role in a movie that would likely never see distribution, while his multi-million-dollar business success remained unmentioned and uncelebrated. When the check came, as always, all eyes turned to him with the expectation that he would handle it. As he reached for his wallet, Marcus felt something shift inside him, a small but significant crack in the foundation of his willingness to remain invisible. The crack widened 3 months later when Marcus discovered that his parents had been telling their friends that David's business acumen and Linda's design skills were responsible for the family's apparent wealth. At a charity gala that Marcus had anonymously sponsored, he overheard his father explaining to a potential client that the Chen family's success came from smart investments and diverse income streams, with no mention of Marcus's contributions. When the client asked about Marcus, David dismissively said, "Oh, he does something with computers. Very technical, very boring." That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, looking at his bank statements and calculating exactly how much of his life he'd spend earning money that his family spent without acknowledgement or appreciation. The number was staggering, not just in dollar terms, but in opportunity cost. He'd foregone vacations, relationships, and personal experiences to maintain their lifestyle, and they'd never once asked him what he wanted or needed for his own happiness. The final straw came, as these things often do, from an unexpected direction. Marcus had been quietly dating someone for 6 months, a fellow entrepreneur named Sarah who ran a successful nonprofit organization. She was brilliant, kind, and genuinely interested in Marcus as a person rather than a financial resource. When he finally worked up the courage to introduce her to his family, the evening went exactly as he'd feared it would. His parents spent the entire dinner talking about Jessica's latest projects, their own social activities, and various expensive renovations they were planning. When Sarah tried to engage Marcus in conversation about his work, David interrupted with questions about her nonprofit's donor base, clearly assessing her potential value to their social network. Linda spent most of the evening discussing interior design trends and luxury travel destinations, apparently oblivious to the fact that their guest might have her own interests and achievements worth discussing. The most telling moment came when Sarah complimented the house and asked about its history. Linda launched into a detailed explanation of how she and David had built their dream home through hard work and smart investments, describing renovation projects and improvements that Marcus had secretly funded. As Sarah listened politely, Marcus realized she was witnessing the same invisibility that had defined his entire relationship with his family. After dinner, as Marcus walked Sarah to her car, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I don't understand your family dynamic," she said carefully. "You're one of the most successful people I know. You're obviously supporting their lifestyle, and they talk about you like you're, I don't know, like you're not really there." Marcus tried to defend them, tried to explain the complex family dynamics and cultural expectations, but Sarah's observation cut too close to the truth. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she said gently, "but I think you deserve better than being treated like an ATM by the people who should love you most." That conversation haunted Marcus for weeks. He began to see his family relationships through Sarah's eyes, and what he saw was painful but undeniable. He was funding a lifestyle that his parents used to maintain their social status, while receiving less recognition and respect than they showed their gardener. Jessica treated him like a benevolent uncle whose primary function was to solve her financial problems, and his parents had become so accustomed to his support that they'd forgotten to see him as anything more than a convenient resource. The realization was devastating, but also liberating. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus began to consider what his life might look like if he stopped prioritizing his family's comfort over his own dignity. He started having conversations with Sarah about the kind of relationship he wanted with people who truly valued him. He began imagining a future where his success was celebrated rather than taken for granted, where his needs mattered as much as everyone else's. But understanding the problem.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Solving it were two entirely different challenges. Marcus had spent 15 years building financial dependency into the foundation of his family relationships. Extracting himself from that role would require not just personal courage, but strategic planning. He couldn't simply cut off the money without destroying relationships entirely, but continuing to enable their entitlement was destroying his own sense of self-worth. What Marcus didn't realize was that the decision about his future role in the family was about to be taken out of his hands entirely. The confrontation that would change everything was already brewing, set in motion by his parents' growing sense of entitlement and Jessica's increasingly expensive lifestyle choices. The family meeting that would end with them screaming, "We hate you," was still weeks away, but the conditions that would make it inevitable were already falling into place. The irony was that Marcus had spent so many years making his family's financial problems disappear that they'd forgotten what real consequences looked like. They were about to learn that the quiet son they'd taken for granted had been paying attention to every slight, every dismissal, and every moment of being treated as invisible. And when they finally pushed him too far, they would discover that the person they'd ignored for so long had the power to make their entire world disappear. The financial records spread across Marcus's kitchen table told a story that even he hadn't fully grasped until that Tuesday evening in March. 3 years of bank statements, credit card bills, and investment portfolios painted a picture of dependency so complete that it bordered on the absurd. His parents weren't just living beyond their means. They were living in a reality where means didn't exist because Marcus had eliminated the concept of financial consequence from their lives. Sarah sat across from him, her nonprofit director's analytical mind processing the numbers with growing disbelief. She'd insisted on seeing the full scope of Marcus's family contributions after their relationship had grown serious enough to discuss shared futures. What she discovered was a level of financial codependency that exceeded anything she'd encountered in her work with struggling families. The mortgage on the Beverly Hills house carried Marcus's name as the primary guarantor, though his parents had never acknowledged this arrangement to him directly. The luxury cars in their driveway were leased through his business accounts. Jessica's credit cards were backed by Marcus's personal guarantees, and her rent on a trendy apartment in West Hollywood was automatically debited from his checking account. Even the family's health insurance was provided through Marcus's company, covering medical expenses that included his mother's extensive cosmetic procedures and his father's experimental wellness treatments. Sarah traced her finger along a particularly damaging line item, a $50,000 charge to a luxury travel agency from the previous summer. When she asked about it, Marcus explained that his parents had taken Jessica on a month-long European tour to celebrate her completion of an acting-intensive program. The trip had been presented to him as a necessary investment in Jessica's career development, a chance for her to experience international culture and expand her artistic perspective. The photographs from that trip still appeared regularly on his family's social media accounts. His parents dining at Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris, Jessica posing in designer clothes against Roman architecture, the entire family lounging on a private yacht off the Greek coast. The captions spoke of gratitude for life's blessings and the importance of family bonds. But Marcus's name never appeared in any of the posts. To anyone following their accounts, the Chen family appeared to be independently wealthy, successful people living their best lives. What made the situation more complex was that Marcus's parents genuinely seemed to believe in their own version of reality. David had convinced himself that his minimal consulting income
And Linda's occasional interior design projects were contributing meaningfully to their lifestyle. They spoke about their financial decisions as if they were making them independently, discussing investments and purchases with the confidence of people who had earned the right to make such choices. Jessica's relationship with money had become even more distorted. At 29, she had never held a traditional job for longer than 6 months, but she lived like someone with a substantial independent income. Her days were filled with yoga classes, acting workshops, art galleries, and expensive lunches with friends who assumed she came from generational wealth. When questioned about her financial situation, she would vaguely reference family support, artistic grants, and potential future earnings from projects that remained perpetually in development. The psychological impact on Marcus was something he'd only begun to understand through his relationship with Sarah. He developed what she recognized as a form of learned helplessness around his own needs and desires. Years of having his contributions minimized or ignored had trained him to derive self-worth primarily from his utility to others. When Sarah suggested they take a vacation together, Marcus's first instinct was to calculate whether his absence would create financial hardship for his family. The intervention Sarah proposed was both simple and terrifying. A family meeting where Marcus would establish clear boundaries around his financial support and require acknowledgement of his contributions to their lifestyle. She'd helped facilitate similar conversations in her nonprofit work with families struggling with addiction and codependency. The principles were the same, whether the substance was drugs or money. Marcus resisted the idea for weeks. He understood intellectually that his current situation was unsustainable, but the emotional programming of 30 years was difficult to overcome. What if his parents genuinely couldn't survive without his support? What if Jessica's mental health suffered from the stress of financial independence? What if setting boundaries destroyed the only relationships he had with his biological family? Sarah's response was characteristically direct. "You're not responsible for managing other adults' emotional reactions to reality," she said during one of their lengthy discussions about the situation. "You're responsible for your own well-being and for not enabling behavior that's destructive to everyone involved." The catalyst for action came from an unexpected source. Marcus received a call from his business partner, David Kim, who'd been reviewing their company's financial records as part of a potential merger discussion. David had noticed the substantial personal expenses that Marcus was running through their business accounts and was concerned about the legal and tax implications. "I don't care how you spend your money," David explained during their meeting in the company's downtown office, "but using business accounts to fund family expenses creates liability for both of us. If we're going to move forward with this merger, you need to clean up your personal financial situation." The merger represented the culmination of 5 years of work building their software company. The acquiring firm was offering enough money to secure Marcus's financial independence permanently, but the deal required complete transparency in their business practices. Marcus realized that his family's financial dependency had become a professional liability that could cost him and his business partner millions of dollars. That evening, Marcus called his parents and Jessica to arrange a family dinner. He told them he had important news to share about his business and wanted to celebrate with them. The irony wasn't lost on him that even when planning to establish boundaries, he was still framing the conversation in terms of what he could provide to them. The dinner was scheduled for the following Sunday at the Beverly Hills house in the formal dining room that Marcus had paid to renovate but had never chosen.
Linda spent the week preparing an elaborate meal, excited about the prospect of more good news from her successful son. David cleared his weekend schedule, assuming that Marcus's business development might create new opportunities for his own consulting work. Jessica canceled plans with friends, hoping that whatever Marcus was celebrating might include financial benefits for her latest artistic endeavor. Marcus spent the week preparing differently. He organized financial documents, drafted talking points, and even consulted with a family therapist about strategies for maintaining emotional equilibrium during difficult conversations. Sarah offered to attend as moral support, but Marcus decided this was something he needed to handle alone. The Sunday dinner began exactly as Marcus had expected. The conversation focused on family news, social events, and various projects that required financial investment. David discussed a potential consulting opportunity that would require upfront funding for marketing materials. Linda described her plans for redecorating the guest bedrooms, complete with cost estimates and timelines. Jessica shared details about an exclusive acting workshop that required a substantial deposit by the following week. Marcus listened to it all with a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing his family dynamic from outside his own body. The casual assumptions about his financial availability, the complete lack of interest in his actual experiences or challenges, the automatic expectation that he would solve any problem that required money. It was a pattern so established that none of them seemed conscious of it anymore. When Marcus finally interrupted the conversation to share his news, the room fell silent with anticipation. He began carefully, explaining that his business was going through a significant transition that would require him to restructure his personal finances. He spoke about the merger opportunity, the legal requirements for financial transparency, and the need to establish clearer boundaries between his personal and business expenses. The first sign of resistance came from Linda, who asked why a business merger would affect his ability to help his family. Marcus tried to explain the concept of financial liability and professional responsibility, but he could see that his words weren't translating into understanding. David interrupted with questions about the merger terms, clearly trying to assess how the deal might benefit the family financially. Jessica's reaction was more direct. She pointed out that the acting workshop deposit was due in 3 days and asked whether Marcus's business situation would prevent him from covering it. When he explained that she would need to find alternative funding, her confusion was genuine. The idea of paying for something herself or of not pursuing an opportunity due to financial constraints was so foreign to her experience that she seemed unable to process the information. Marcus had prepared for resistance, but he hadn't anticipated the complete incomprehension that greeted his attempts to establish boundaries. His family wasn't rejecting his new policies out of selfishness or manipulation. They literally couldn't understand a reality where Marcus's money wasn't automatically available to solve their problems.
The conversation deteriorated rapidly when Marcus presented the financial documents that detailed his contributions to their lifestyle. The mortgage records, lease agreements, credit card statements, and bank transfers that proved his role as their primary financial support were met with shock and denial that seemed entirely authentic. David's first reaction was to question the accuracy of the documents. He suggested that Marcus was confused about their financial arrangements, that there had been misunderstandings about loans versus gifts, that the family's expenses were more balanced than the paperwork indicated. When Marcus provided additional documentation, David's tone shifted to anger. He accused Marcus of making their family look like charity cases, of exaggerating his contributions to make himself feel important.
Linda's response was emotional rather than analytical. She cried when confronted with evidence of her dependence on Marcus's support, insisting that she'd believed her husband was providing for their lifestyle through his business success. When Marcus showed her the credit card statements that revealed the true cost of their social activities, she accused him of spying on them and violating their privacy. Jessica's reaction was the most devastating because it revealed the depth of her disconnection from financial reality. She insisted that Marcus was lying about supporting her, that she earned her own money through various artistic projects, that her lifestyle was modest and self-funded. When presented with bank records showing years of direct transfers to her accounts, she claimed the money was reimbursement for loans she'd forgotten making to Marcus. The family meeting that was supposed to establish healthy boundaries instead revealed that Marcus had enabled a level of financial delusion that bordered on psychological disorder. His parents and sister weren't just dependent on his money, they'd constructed an entire identity around being successful, independent people. Acknowledging their dependence would require them to rebuild their self-concept from scratch. Marcus tried to salvage the conversation by focusing on practical solutions rather than emotional recriminations. He proposed a gradual transition period where he would continue supporting essential expenses while his family developed independent income sources. He offered to help them create budgets, find employment, and develop realistic financial plans. The response was immediate and overwhelming rejection. David shouted that he didn't need career advice from his son, that he had been managing money since before Marcus was born, that any financial problems were temporary setbacks rather than systemic issues. Linda accused Marcus of trying to control them, of using money to manipulate their behavior, of being cruel and ungrateful after everything they sacrificed for his success. Jessica's reaction was the most painful. She stood up from the table and declared that she'd never asked for Marcus's help, that she didn't want his money if it came with conditions, that she'd rather live in poverty than be controlled by her brother's financial demands. The irony of her statement, delivered while wearing designer clothes in a house furnished with Marcus's money, was apparently lost on everyone except Marcus himself. The evening reached its breaking point when Marcus tried to explain that establishing boundaries wasn't punishment, but necessity. He described the merger opportunity, the legal requirements, the potential consequences of maintaining their current financial arrangements. His family's response revealed that they'd never considered his needs, his goals, or his rights as separate from their own. David's explosion was volcanic. He accused Marcus of being selfish, ungrateful, and arrogant. He claimed that the family had sacrificed everything from Marcus's education and success, that they deserved to benefit from his achievements, that his refusal to continue supporting them was a betrayal of fundamental family obligations. The accusations were delivered with such genuine conviction that Marcus realized his father truly believed every word. Linda's breakdown was equally intense, but more manipulative. She sobbed about the shame of having her financial dependence exposed, the humiliation of potentially losing their social status, the fear of having to downsize their lifestyle. Her tears were real, but Marcus recognized that they were focused entirely on her own losses rather than any concern for his well-being.
Jessica's final statement was the one that shattered whatever remained of Marcus's hope for reconciliation. She looked directly at him and said, "I wish you had never made any money. I wish you were still nobody special, so we could all be happy again." The words hung in the air for a long moment before David added the final blow. "You know what, Marcus? We hate you. We hate what you've become, and
You're trying to do to this family." Linda nodded through her tears and repeated the words. "We hate you!" Jessica crossed her arms and stared at Marcus with genuine contempt. "We hate you!" Marcus sat in the dining room he'd paid for, surrounded by furniture he'd purchased, looking at family members whose lifestyle he'd funded for 15 years, and listened to them explain how much they hated him for trying to establish the most basic boundaries around his financial support. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Marcus's chair scraping against the hardwood floor as he stood up. He looked around the room one final time, taking in the faces of 3 people who had just demonstrated that their love for him was entirely conditional on his willingness to remain financially invisible. Without saying another word, Marcus walked out of the house and into a future that would prove to his family just how much power the person they'd taken for granted had actually accumulated over the years. The quiet son they'd just finished screaming at was about to show them what life looked like when the person who owned everything decided to stop pretending he didn't. Marcus Chen woke up the morning after the dinner confrontation with a clarity he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The emotional fog that had clouded his decision-making since college had lifted overnight, replaced by the analytical precision that had built his fortune. His family had finally shown him exactly who they were when the facade of gratitude was stripped away. And now, he would show them exactly who he was when the safety net of his protection disappeared. The first call Marcus made was to his attorney, Jonathan Reeves, a partner at one of Century City's most prestigious law firms. Jonathan had handled Marcus's business transactions for 5 years and was intimately familiar with the complex web of financial arrangements that supported the Chen family lifestyle. What Jonathan didn't know was the extent to which those arrangements had been maintained without proper documentation or acknowledgement. Marcus arrived at Jonathan's office at 7:30 Monday morning, carrying 3 boxes of financial records, legal documents, and digital evidence that told the complete story of his family's dependents. The attorney's conference room became a command center as they spread out 15 years of bank statements, mortgage documents, lease agreements, and business records that revealed the true architecture of the Chen family's apparent success. Jonathan's first observation was professional and devastating. "Marcus, you've been operating as an undocumented bank for your family. Every one of these financial arrangements creates liability for you while providing them with benefits they haven't acknowledged or reciprocated. From a legal standpoint, you have grounds to demand immediate repayment of what amounts to several $1 million in unauthorized loans." The mortgage on the Beverly Hills house was particularly problematic. Marcus's parents had signed the original papers 20 years earlier, but a series of refinancing arrangements had gradually shifted the actual ownership to Marcus's name. David and Linda were listed as residents, but Marcus held the title and bore full responsibility for the payments. They'd been living in his house while treating him like an unwelcome guest in their home. The lease arrangements for their luxury vehicles were even more straightforward. Marcus's business accounts had been paying for cars that his family members drove exclusively with no written agreements about usage, maintenance, or responsibility. Jessica's Porsche, David's BMW, and Linda's Mercedes were all titled under Marcus's company, making them business assets that were being misused for personal purposes. Jessica's financial situation was the most complex because it involved both direct monetary support and indirect subsidization of her lifestyle. Marcus had been covering her rent, utilities, credit card payments, and various expenses related to her artistic pursuits. Additionally,
He'd funded what she described as investments in her career, but what the documentation revealed as payments for expensive lifestyle choices disguised as professional development. Jonathan's analysis revealed something that Marcus hadn't fully grasped. His family's total dependence on his support meant that he held complete control over their lifestyle. They weren't just receiving help, they were living entirely at his discretion. The house they lived in, the cars they drove, the credit cards they used, the social activities they enjoyed, and the basic maintenance of their daily lives were all dependent on Marcus's continued willingness to provide funding. The attorney's recommendation was comprehensive and ruthless. Marcus could legally reclaim every asset he'd purchased, cancel every financial arrangement he'd funded, and demand immediate repayment of every undocumented loan he'd provided. Moreover, because his family had been living in his property and using his assets without legal agreements, they were technically trespassers and thieves under California law. Marcus spent the morning working with Jonathan to develop a strategic plan for reclaiming control of his financial life. The approach would be methodical and thorough, designed to demonstrate the full extent of his family's dependence, while providing them with opportunities to develop independence. It wasn't revenge, it was consequences. The first step was securing legal ownership of all assets. Marcus filed paperwork to clarify his ownership of the Beverly Hills house, ensuring that any ambiguity about property rights was eliminated. He registered the luxury vehicles as business assets and documented their unauthorized personal use by his family members. He consolidated all financial accounts and removed his parents' and sisters' access to funds they'd never legally controlled. The second step was terminating all ongoing financial support. Marcus canceled the credit cards his family used, stopped automatic payments for their living expenses, and suspended all transfers that had been maintaining their lifestyle. The termination was immediate and comprehensive, designed to demonstrate exactly how extensive their dependence had become. The third step was the most devastating. Marcus initiated legal proceedings to collect the millions of dollars in undocumented loans he'd provided over the years. The lawsuits weren't intended to actually recover the money, which Marcus knew his family didn't possess, but to create legal documentation of their debt and dependence. By Tuesday afternoon, the consequences of Marcus's actions were beginning to ripple through his family's carefully constructed world. David received a call from the bank informing him that the mortgage payment on the house had been declined. Linda discovered that her credit cards were being rejected at her favorite boutique. Jessica found that her rent payment had bounced and her landlord was demanding immediate payment plus penalties. The phone calls started within hours. David's first message was confused and angry, demanding to know why Marcus was playing games with their family's finances. Linda's voicemail was tearful and manipulative, begging Marcus to fix whatever technical problems were preventing their normal financial arrangements from functioning. Jessica's text messages were increasingly frantic as she realized that her entire lifestyle had evaporated overnight. Marcus didn't respond to any of the communications. He'd learned from years of managing business negotiations that responding too quickly to pressure tactics only encouraged more extreme behavior. Instead, he focused on the next phase of his plan, demonstrating the full scope of their dependence. The eviction notice for the Beverly Hills house was delivered Wednesday morning by a professional process server. The document, signed by Marcus as the legal owner, gave his family 30 days to vacate the property they'd been occupying without lease agreements or rental payments. The notice included a detailed accounting of their occupancy costs, calculated at fair market rental rates.
For a luxury property in Beverly Hills, the vehicle repossessions began Wednesday afternoon. Marcus had hired a professional recovery service to collect the cars that his business owned, but his family had been using without authorization. David's BMW disappeared from his office parking lot during a client meeting. Linda's Mercedes was towed from a shopping center while she was inside getting her nails done. Jessica's Porsche vanished from her apartment complex overnight. By Thursday, Marcus's family was discovering what life looked like without his financial foundation. David's consulting business, which had been propped up by Marcus's subsidization of their living expenses, immediately faced a cash flow crisis when David couldn't afford the basic operational costs. Linda's interior design work, which had been more hobby than profession due to Marcus's support, suddenly needed to generate actual income rather than supplemental spending money. Jessica's situation was the most dramatic because her entire adult life had been built around the assumption of financial support. She'd never developed the skills, habits, or relationships necessary for independent survival. Her expensive apartment became unaffordable without Marcus's rent payments. Her artistic pursuits became impossible without funding for classes, materials, and networking events. Her social life collapsed when she couldn't afford the restaurants, activities, and lifestyle maintenance that had defined her identity. The media attention began Friday morning when a business reporter noticed the unusual legal filings related to Marcus's family. The story of a tech entrepreneur suing his own parents and sister for millions in undocumented loans was too compelling for the financial press to ignore. Within hours, the narrative had evolved from a business story to a human interest piece about family dysfunction and financial codependency. The public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of Marcus's position. Social media filled with stories from people who'd experienced similar family financial manipulation. Support groups for adult children of financially dependent parents reached out to offer solidarity and advice. Financial advisors used Marcus's situation as a cautionary tale about the dangers of undocumented family loans and the importance of legal boundaries in personal relationships. Marcus's family discovered that their social circle had been built around their apparent wealth rather than genuine relationships. Friends who'd enjoyed expensive dinners and luxury vacations at Marcus's expense suddenly became unavailable when the invitations stopped coming. Social events that had defined their calendar became financially impossible when the lifestyle they believed was their identity revealed itself to be nothing more than Marcus's generosity misinterpreted as their own success. David's attempts to maintain his consulting business without Marcus's subsidization exposed the fundamental weakness of his professional reputation. Clients who'd been impressed by his apparent success began questioning his competence when he couldn't afford basic business expenses. Networking opportunities that had seemed to validate his expertise were revealed as social events he could only attend because Marcus had been funding his lifestyle. Linda's reaction to the loss of financial security was the most psychologically complex. She had spent 20 years believing she was a successful interior designer, married to a prosperous consultant, living in a beautiful house earned through their combined efforts. Discovering that their entire lifestyle had been an illusion funded by their son created an identity crisis that she was unprepared to handle. The breakdown began when Linda realized that her friends had never been interested in her as a person, but as a hostess who could provide expensive entertainment. The charity boards she'd served on were primarily interested in her financial contributions rather than her insights or efforts. The social status she'd cultivated was entirely dependent on resources she'd never actually controlled. Jessica's decision
was rapid and dramatic. Without Marcus's financial support, she was forced to confront the reality that her artistic career was more aspiration than achievement. Acting classes she couldn't afford, auditions she couldn't reach without a car, and networking events she couldn't attend without appropriate clothing all became impossible obstacles. The most devastating revelation for Jessica was that her identity as an artist had been subsidized performance art. She'd been playing the role of a struggling artist without ever experiencing actual struggle, pursuing creative dreams without risking real failure, and maintaining artistic integrity without making the sacrifices that genuine independence required. The intervention that changed everything came from an unexpected source: Sarah, Marcus's girlfriend, who'd been watching his family's public breakdown with growing concern. Despite everything they'd done to Marcus, Sarah recognized that their complete destruction wouldn't ultimately serve anyone's best interests. Sarah's approach was characteristic of her nonprofit background. She focused on solutions rather than punishment, on rehabilitation rather than retribution. She convinced Marcus to meet with a family therapist who specialized in financial codependency and narcissistic family dynamics. The therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, reviewed Marcus's documentation and his family's public statements about their situation. Her assessment was clear and devastating.
Marcus's family had developed a form of financial narcissism that made them incapable of recognizing his contributions or their dependence. They genuinely believed they deserved his support and that his boundary setting was a form of cruelty. Dr. Morrison's recommendation was structured and conditional. Marcus could offer his family a path back to relationship, but only if they completed intensive therapy focused on financial responsibility and emotional accountability. The terms were non-negotiable: acknowledgement of their dependence, genuine appreciation for his support, development of independent income sources, and legal agreements that protected everyone's interests. The ultimatum Marcus delivered to his family was delivered through Jonathan's law office, ensuring that every communication was documented and legally binding. His parents and Jessica could retain their relationships with him, but only under completely restructured terms that acknowledged reality rather than perpetuating their comfortable illusions. David and Linda would be allowed to remain in the Beverly Hills house, but as tenants, paying market-rate rent from income they earned independently. They would have 6 months to develop sustainable business models and demonstrate their ability to support themselves. Jessica would receive 1 year of basic living expenses while she developed genuine career skills and emotional independence. The conditions were comprehensive and humiliating: weekly therapy sessions, monthly financial counseling, quarterly progress reviews, and annual evaluations of their relationship dynamics. Marcus would provide support, but never again would he provide invisible subsidization that allowed them to maintain illusions about their own success. Marcus's family faced a choice that was both simple and devastating: accept reality and rebuild their relationships on honest foundations, or maintain their pride and lose their son forever. The decision revealed exactly who they were when forced to choose between their egos and their love for Marcus. David was the first to capitulate, his business background helping him recognize that Marcus's terms were actually generous given the legal alternatives. Linda's acceptance came through tears and genuine remorse, her maternal instincts finally overcoming her social vanity. Jessica's agreement took the longest because it required her to abandon the artistic identity she'd built around being supported rather than successful. The process of rebuilding took 2 years, but it resulted in relationships that were healthier and more honest than anything the Chen family had experienced.
Before, David developed a legitimate consulting practice that provided modest but sustainable income. Linda channeled her design skills into a small business that served middle-class clients rather than luxury markets. Jessica discovered that her artistic abilities were real when she finally applied them to work that paid bills rather than pursuing dreams funded by others. Marcus's merger proceeded successfully, making him independently wealthy beyond his family's ability to drain. His relationship with Sarah deepened into marriage, providing him with the genuine love and appreciation he'd never received from his biological family. The boundaries he'd established proved to be the foundation for respect, rather than the barrier to relationship he'd feared. The most surprising outcome was that Marcus's parents and sister eventually expressed genuine gratitude for the crisis he'd forced upon them. They'd discovered independence they didn't know they wanted, self-respect they hadn't realized they'd lost, and relationships based on mutual affection rather than financial utility. The house in Beverly Hills became a symbol of their transformed dynamic. Marcus owned it, his parents lived in it as paying tenants, and family gatherings happened there as celebrations of genuine achievement rather than displays of subsidized success. The dining room where they'd screamed their hatred became the place where they learned to express authentic love. Marcus's story became a case study in business schools and therapy programs, demonstrating both the dangers of financial codependency and the possibility of redemption through honest confrontation. His family's transformation proved that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt when everyone involved was willing to acknowledge reality and work toward mutual respect. The final irony was that Marcus's family's wealth ultimately became real rather than illusory. Without his subsidization forcing them to remain dependent, they developed the skills and motivation necessary for genuine success. The lifestyle they'd enjoyed through his generosity became the lifestyle they earned through their own efforts. Years later, when business journalists asked Marcus about his decision to financially cut off his family, his answer was always the same. I didn't destroy their lives. I revealed their lives. The difference between those two things is the difference between punishment and love. The Chen family's story became proof that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for people you love is to stop enabling their weaknesses and start requiring them to discover their strengths. Marcus learned that being invisible had been a choice, and choosing to be seen had been the gift his family needed most, even when they initially hated him for providing it. The 24 hours following Marcus's departure from the family dinner were filled with a silence that felt more like preparation than peace. He spent Monday morning in his downtown apartment, surrounded by the modest furnishings he'd chosen while his family lived in luxury, and began the methodical process of dismantling 15 years of financial entanglement. The first decision was the most symbolic. He would not take their calls, respond to their messages, or engage with their attempts to restore the previous dynamic through emotional manipulation. Marcus's apartment had always been a stark contrast to his family's Beverly Hills mansion. While they enjoyed marble countertops and imported fixtures, he lived with basic furniture and minimal decoration. The difference hadn't bothered him before because he'd believed he was investing in their happiness. But now the contrast seemed like evidence of how completely he'd prioritized their comfort over his own dignity. The legal documentation process began immediately. Jonathan had arranged for a team of paralegals to review every financial transaction between Marcus and his family members over the past decade. What they discovered was a pattern of dependency so systematic that it resembled a carefully orchestrated fraud scheme, except that Mark
Had been the one orchestrating his own exploitation. The Beverly Hills house represented the cornerstone of the family's apparent wealth, but the property records revealed a complicated truth. David and Linda had purchased the house in 1995 with a substantial mortgage that they'd barely been able to afford on their actual income. Over the years, a series of refinancing arrangements had gradually shifted financial responsibility to Marcus, while leaving his parents with the illusion of ownership. The first refinancing had occurred when Marcus was in college. His parents had used his excellent credit score as a cosigner, ostensibly to secure better interest rates. The second refinancing happened when Marcus started earning significant income from his tech career. His parents had convinced him that consolidating their debts would save the family money in the long term. The third and final refinancing had effectively transferred complete ownership to Marcus, while allowing his parents to remain in residence as though nothing had changed. Marcus had never demanded rent, lease agreements, or formal acknowledgement of his ownership, because doing so had seemed petty and ungenerous. He'd believed that family relationships should transcend legal documentation and that his parents would naturally recognize and appreciate his support. The reality was that his generosity had enabled them to maintain complete financial irresponsibility while enjoying the benefits of his success. The vehicle situation was similarly complex but more straightforward legally. Marcus's business had been leasing luxury cars that his family members drove exclusively. The arrangement had begun when Jessica needed reliable transportation for auditions, but had expanded to include vehicles for his parents that were far more expensive than their actual income could justify. David drove a BMW X7 that cost more per month than many people's rent. Linda's Mercedes E-Class was equipped with every luxury option available. Jessica's Porsche Cayenne was a recent upgrade from a less expensive vehicle that she'd claimed was damaging her professional image. None of them had ever made a payment, signed a lease agreement, or acknowledged that the vehicles belonged to Marcus's company rather than to them personally. The credit card situation was the most psychologically revealing aspect of the family's financial dependence. Marcus had provided his parents and sister with credit cards connected to his accounts, initially as emergency backup for unexpected expenses.
Over time, those cards had become their primary spending instruments for everything from grocery shopping to luxury vacations. The monthly statements told a story of people who'd completely lost touch with the value of money. Restaurant bills that exceeded Marcus's rent. Shopping sprees that cost more than most people's cars. Spa treatments and luxury services that were charged without any consideration of cost or necessity. His family had been living like wealthy people because Marcus's money had eliminated any connection between their desires and their ability to pay for them. Jessica's financial records were particularly disturbing because they revealed someone who'd never learned to distinguish between wants and needs. Her credit card charges included daily coffee shop visits that cost $50, clothing purchases that totaled thousands of dollars per month, and various wellness services that treated self-care as though it required unlimited funding. The entertainment expenses were especially painful for Marcus to review. His family had been attending concerts, sporting events, theater productions, and social gatherings that cost thousands of dollars per event. They'd been living a social life that placed them among genuinely wealthy families while contributing nothing to the expenses that maintained their status. Marcus's business partner, David Kim, spent Tuesday morning reviewing the separated financial records and calculating the impact on their company's merger prospects. The clean separation of personal and business expenses would actually
strengthen their position with potential buyers, but the psychological toll on Marcus was evident in his work performance and decision-making. "You look like someone who's been carrying a weight for years and just realized he could put it down," David observed during their Tuesday afternoon meeting. "The financial situation was hurting the business, but watching you try to manage your family's emotional reactions was worse for your work than the money ever was." Marcus realized that his business partner was right. The mental energy he'd been devoting to managing his family's financial needs and emotional demands had been limiting his professional effectiveness for years. He'd been operating at partial capacity, always keeping part of his attention focused on potential family crises that might require his intervention. Wednesday brought the first wave of serious consequences for the Chen family. The mortgage payment that David had assumed would process automatically was rejected by the bank, generating penalty fees and a notice of potential foreclosure proceedings. The credit cards that Linda relied on for her daily expenses were declined at every point of sale. Jessica's rent check bounced, creating immediate housing insecurity and damaging her rental history. David's response was to call Marcus repeatedly, leaving increasingly angry voicemails that revealed his complete inability to understand the situation. His messages ranged from confusion about technical banking problems to rage about Marcus's ingratitude and selfishness. None of the voicemails included acknowledgement of dependency, expression of appreciation for past support, or recognition that Marcus had rights regarding his own money. Linda's reaction was more emotional but equally self-centered. Her messages were filled with tears and manipulation, describing the humiliation of having credit cards declined in public, the stress of not understanding their financial situation, and the unfairness of Marcus punishing them for unclear reasons. She never mentioned concern for Marcus's well-being, curiosity about his perspective, or awareness that her lifestyle had been dependent on his generosity. Jessica's communications revealed the most complete disconnection from financial reality. Her messages expressed genuine bewilderment about why her normal spending patterns were suddenly creating problems, as though she'd never understood that money had to come from somewhere. She described the situation as though Marcus was withholding services that she was entitled to receive, like canceling a subscription, rather than eliminating financial support she'd never earned. The property management company that Marcus hired to handle the Beverly Hills house delivered the eviction notice Wednesday morning, along with a comprehensive accounting of fair market rental rates for luxury properties in the area. The document calculated that David and Linda had been receiving approximately $15,000 per month in free housing, not including utilities, maintenance, and property taxes that Marcus had been covering. The vehicle recovery operation was completed by Wednesday evening. Marcus had chosen to have the cars repossessed simultaneously to prevent his family from hiding or transferring the vehicles once they realized what was happening.
Professional recovery agents collected the BMW from David's office, the Mercedes from Linda's shopping expedition, and the Porsche from Jessica's apartment complex. The psychological impact of losing transportation was immediate and devastating for family members who'd never experienced limitations on their mobility. David found himself unable to meet clients or maintain the professional image his consulting business required. Linda couldn't access the shopping, social, and wellness activities that had structured her daily routine. Jessica lost the independence that had allowed her to pursue auditions, classes, and social events across Los Angeles. Thursday morning brought the new wave of consequences as the family discovered how extensively their lifestyle had been dependent on
work performance and decision-making. You look like someone who's been carrying a weight for years and just realized he could put it down, David observed during their Tuesday afternoon meeting. The financial situation was hurting the business, but watching you try to manage your family's emotional reactions was worse for your work than the money ever was. Marcus realized that his business partner was right. The mental energy he'd been devoting to managing his family's financial needs and emotional demands had been limiting his professional effectiveness for years. He'd been operating at partial capacity, always keeping part of his attention focused on potential family crises that might require his intervention. Wednesday brought the first wave of serious consequences for the Chen family. The mortgage payment that David had assumed would process automatically was rejected by the bank, generating penalty fees and a notice of potential foreclosure proceedings. The credit cards that Linda relied on for her daily expenses were declined at every point of sale. Jessica's rent check bounced, creating immediate housing insecurity and damaging her rental history. David's response was to call Marcus repeatedly, leaving increasingly angry voicemails that revealed his complete inability to understand the situation. His messages ranged from confusion about technical banking problems to rage about Marcus's ingratitude and selfishness. None of the voicemails included acknowledgement of dependency, expression of appreciation for past support, or recognition that Marcus had rights regarding his own money. Linda's reaction was more emotional but equally self-centered. Her messages were filled with tears and manipulation, describing the humiliation of having credit cards declined in public, the stress of not understanding their financial situation, and the unfairness of Marcus punishing them for unclear reasons. She never mentioned concern for Marcus's well-being, curiosity about his perspective, or awareness that her lifestyle had been dependent on his generosity. Jessica's communications revealed the most complete disconnection from financial reality. Her messages expressed genuine bewilderment about why her normal spending patterns were suddenly creating problems, as though she'd never understood that money had to come from somewhere. She described the situation as though Marcus was withholding services that she was entitled to receive, like canceling a subscription, rather than eliminating financial support she'd never earned. The property management company that Marcus hired to handle the Beverly Hills house delivered the eviction notice Wednesday morning, along with a comprehensive accounting of fair market rental rates for luxury properties in the area. The document calculated that David and Linda had been receiving approximately $15,000 per month in free housing, not including utilities, maintenance, and property taxes that Marcus had been covering. The vehicle recovery operation was completed by Wednesday evening. Marcus had chosen to have the cars repossessed simultaneously to prevent his family from hiding or transferring the vehicles once they realized what was happening. Professional recovery agents collected the BMW from David's office, the Mercedes from Linda's shopping expedition, and the Porsche from Jessica's apartment complex. The psychological impact of losing transportation was immediate and devastating for family members who'd never experienced limitations on their mobility. David found himself unable to meet clients or maintain the professional image his consulting business required. Linda couldn't access the shopping, social, and wellness activities that had structured her daily routine. Jessica lost the independence that had allowed her to pursue auditions, classes, and social events across Los Angeles. Thursday morning brought a new wave of consequences as the family discovered how extensively their lifestyle had been dependent on Marcus's financial support. The house's utilities were scheduled for disconnection because the automatic payments had been linked to Marcus's accounts. The insurance policies for their vehicles had been canceled, along with the lease agreements. Even their cell phone service was threatened because Marcus had been covering their family plan. David's consulting business faced immediate collapse when he couldn't afford the basic operational expenses that Marcus had been covering through various indirect subsidies.
office rent, professional insurance, marketing materials, and networking event fees had all been funded through Marcus's support without David's conscious awareness. The business that he'd believed demonstrated his professional competence was revealed as an expensive hobby maintained by his son's generosity. Linda's interior design work encountered similar problems when she discovered that many of her professional expenses had been covered by Marcus's business accounts. The design software subscriptions, trade publication memberships, professional association fees, and even some client entertainment expenses had been paid through arrangements that Linda had never questioned or acknowledged. Jessica's artistic pursuits became impossible when the full scope of Marcus's support was removed. Acting classes, voice coaching, dance instruction, photography sessions, and networking events had all been funded through Marcus's contributions to her lifestyle. Without that support, she faced the reality that her artistic career had been more expensive performance than genuine professional development. The social media documentation of the family's reaction provided Marcus with real-time evidence of their psychological processing. David's posts shifted from confident business content to angry rants about family loyalty and obligation. Linda's Instagram feed evolved from luxury lifestyle photos to emotional appeals about the importance of family bonds. Jessica's social media became increasingly desperate as she sought financial support from friends who'd assumed she was independently wealthy. The most revealing aspect of their public communication was the complete absence of self-reflection or accountability. None of Marcus's family members acknowledged their dependence on his support, expressed gratitude for his past generosity, or demonstrated understanding of his perspective. Instead, they framed the situation as Marcus's betrayal of family obligations and his failure to prioritize their needs over his own selfish desires. Friday's developments included the first legal responses to Marcus's debt collection lawsuits. His family had received formal notices demanding repayment of millions of dollars in undocumented loans, along with a detailed accounting of every financial contribution Marcus had made to their lifestyle. The legal documentation was comprehensive and damning, revealing the extent to which they'd been living beyond their means with his support. David's attorney informed him that the debt claims were legally valid and that Marcus had documentation supporting every dollar of the alleged loans. The attorney's advice was simple and devastating. Marcus had the legal right to collect the money, seize assets to satisfy the debts, and pursue additional damages for unauthorized use of his property and credit. Linda's legal consultation produced similar results. Her attorney explained that occupying Marcus's house without lease agreements or rental payments created legal liability that extended beyond simple debt collection. She could be charged with trespassing, theft of services, and potentially fraud, depending on how aggressively Marcus chose to pursue legal remedies. Jessica's legal situation was the most complex because her financial dependence had been so extensive and so thoroughly documented. Her attorney calculated that she owed Marcus more money than she could realistically repay in her lifetime, making bankruptcy her most viable option for financial recovery. The weekend brought the first attempts at family reconciliation, but they revealed that Marcus's parents and sister still didn't understand the fundamental issues underlying their conflict. David's approach was to offer compromise solutions that maintained his dignity while providing Marcus with token acknowledgement of his contributions. Linda suggested family therapy focused on communication rather than financial accountability. Jessica proposed that they simply return to their previous arrangements with better documentation and more explicit expressions of gratitude. Marcus's response to their reconciliation attempts was prepared with Jonathan's legal guidance and Dr. Morrison's therapeutic insight. He would consider rebuilding relationships with family members, but only after they demonstrated genuine understanding of their dependence and authentic appreciation for his support. The terms were non-negotiable because compromise had already been tried and had resulted in their hatred and rejection. The conditions Marcus established for potential reconciliation were comprehensive and transformative. His family members would need to acknowledge publicly and privately that their lifestyle had been dependent on his generosity. They would need to develop independent income sources sufficient to support themselves without his assistance. They would need to participate in individual and family therapy focused on developing healthy relationship dynamics. Most importantly, they would need to demonstrate through actions rather than words that they valued Marcus as a person rather than as a financial resource. This meant showing interest in his life, celebrating his achievements, supporting his goals, and treating him with the respect they expected to receive from him. The transformation that occurred over the following months was both painful and remarkable. David's forced return to genuine work revealed professional skills he'd forgotten he possessed. Without Marcus's subsidization allowing him to be selective about clients and projects, he developed a work ethic and business acumen that generated real success rather than the appearance of success. Linda's design business flourished when she focused on serving clients who actually needed her services rather than maintaining a prestigious client base she couldn't afford to pursue. Working with middle-class families who appreciated her skills and paid their bills promptly proved more satisfying than the high-end projects that had been more about social status than professional fulfillment. Jessica's artistic development accelerated dramatically when she was forced to treat her career as a business rather than an expensive hobby. She discovered talents for commercial art and graphic design that provided steady income while allowing her to pursue more experimental work on her own time. The financial pressure that had initially seemed cruel actually provided the motivation and focus her artistic development had been lacking. The psychological transformation was even more significant than the financial adjustments. Marcus's family members discovered self-respect they hadn't realized they'd lost through years of dependency. They developed pride in their own achievements rather than borrowed pride from Marcus's success. They learned to value relationships based on mutual affection rather than financial utility. The most profound change was in how they treated Marcus. For the first time in his adult life, his parents and sister began asking about his experiences, celebrating his achievements, and offering support for his goals. They discovered that the son and brother they'd taken for granted was actually an interesting, accomplished person whose life extended far beyond his usefulness to them. Marcus's relationship with Sarah deepened as he learned to prioritize his own needs and desires rather than constantly managing his family's emotional and financial crises. They traveled together, built a home together, and eventually married in a ceremony where Marcus's family attended as genuine supporters rather than financial beneficiaries. The business merger that had initially created the crisis ultimately provided Marcus with the financial independence that made his family's approval irrelevant. He could afford to maintain relationships with them based on mutual affection rather than their need for his support. The power dynamic that had defined their interactions for 15 years was finally balanced. Years later, the Chen family story became a case study in financial therapy programs and family counseling practices. Their experience demonstrated both the destructive potential of financial codependency and the possibility for redemption when all parties were willing to confront reality and work toward healthier dynamics. Marcus's decision to force the crisis rather than continuing to enable his family's dysfunction proved to be the most loving action he could have taken. By requiring them to develop independence and self-respect, he'd given them the opportunity to become the people they were capable of being rather than the dependent relatives they'd allowed themselves to become. The mansion in Beverly Hills remained in the family, but as a symbol of earned success rather than subsidized lifestyle. The luxury cars returned to the driveway, but purchased with money his parents and sister had earned themselves. The family dinners continued, but as celebrations of mutual achievement rather than opportunities for financial negotiation. The relationship between Marcus and his family evolved into something healthier and more sustainable than what they'd shared before the crisis. They learned to love each other for who they were, rather than what they could provide, and they discovered that genuine affection was more satisfying than relationships based on financial dependency. The final conversation Marcus had with his parents about their transformed relationship occurred 2 years after the initial confrontation. David and Linda had invited him to dinner to celebrate the second anniversary of Linda's design business, which had grown into a profitable enterprise that employed 3 other designers and served clients throughout Southern California. During that dinner, David offered something he'd never provided before, a genuine apology for taking Marcus's generosity for granted, and an acknowledgement of how completely their family's lifestyle had depended on his financial support. Linda expressed gratitude not just for the money Marcus had provided, but for the crisis that had forced her to discover her own capabilities and self-worth. Jessica's transformation had been the most dramatic because her dependence had been the most complete. She developed a successful graphic design business that combined her artistic talents with commercial viability. Her apartment in West Hollywood was smaller than her previous residence, but paid for with her own earnings. Her social life was built around relationships with people who valued her personality and creativity rather than her apparent wealth. The most meaningful change was that Jessica had begun supporting Marcus in small but significant ways. She designed the logo for his latest business venture, helped him with personal projects that had nothing to do with money, and become someone he could rely on for emotional support rather than someone who relied on him for financial support. Marcus's story resonated with thousands of people who'd experienced similar family financial dynamics. The business media coverage had evolved into discussions about healthy family financial boundaries and the psychological impact of generational wealth transfer. Financial advisors began using Marcus's experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of documentation and clear agreements in family financial relationships. The therapeutic community embraced Marcus's story as evidence that even the most entrenched family dysfunction could be addressed through appropriate intervention and boundary setting. Dr. Morrison published articles about financial codependency using the Chen family as an anonymous case study, demonstrating how enabling behavior could be transformed into empowerment through skilled intervention. Therapeutic intervention. Marcus's relationship with Sarah had provided him with a template for healthy emotional and financial dynamics. Sarah had never asked him for money, never expected him to solve her problems, and never treated his success as though it belonged to her. Instead, she'd supported his goals, celebrated his achievements, and offered partnership rather than dependency. Their marriage became a model for the kind of relationship Marcus had always wanted, but had never experienced with his family. Sarah's nonprofit work provided her with independent purpose and income, while Marcus's business success allowed them to enjoy a comfortable lifestyle without anyone feeling exploited or taken for granted. The Chen family's transformation became complete when they began supporting Marcus's goals rather than simply benefiting from his success. David used his consulting skills to help Marcus evaluate potential business investments. Linda offered design services for Marcus's office spaces and personal residences. Jessica created marketing materials for Marcus's companies and provided creative input for his business development. The shift from being financial dependents to being genuine partners in Marcus's life represented a fundamental change in their family dynamics. Instead of seeing Marcus as a resource to be managed and depleted, they began treating him as a valuable family member whose success benefited everyone when shared willingly rather than extracted through emotional manipulation. The legal resolution of their financial disputes took 18 months to complete, but the outcome was more generous than Marcus's family had any right to expect. Rather than demanding full repayment of the millions he'd provided over the years, Marcus structured settlement agreements that allowed his parents and sister to retain some assets while acknowledging their debts and establishing their independence. David and Linda were allowed to purchase their Beverly Hills house from Marcus at below-market rates, with financing terms that reflected their actual income rather than their previous lifestyle expectations. The arrangement provided them with genuine home ownership while ensuring that Marcus recovered his investment and eliminated his ongoing financial liability. Jessica's settlement included forgiveness of most of her accumulated debt in exchange for her commitment to maintain financial independence and continue therapy focused on developing healthy relationship patterns. Marcus also provided her with business development support that helped her establish her graphic design company without creating new financial dependency. The vehicles were resolved through a combination of transfers and purchases that allowed the family to maintain transportation while acknowledging Marcus's ownership of the assets they'd been using. David and Linda purchased used cars that reflected their actual income level, while Jessica leased a vehicle she could afford through her design business earnings. The social impact of the Chen family's transformation extended beyond their personal relationships. Their story inspired other families struggling with financial codependency to seek therapy and establish healthier boundaries. Marcus began speaking at business conferences about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries in family financial relationships. Sarah's nonprofit work expanded to include financial counseling for families dealing with intergenerational wealth issues. Her experience with Marcus's situation had taught her about the unique challenges faced by successful individuals whose achievements were exploited by family members. She developed programs specifically designed to help financially successful people establish healthy boundaries with dependent relatives. The therapeutic insights from the Chen family's experience contributed to research about financial narcissism and family codependency. Dr. Morrison's work with the family provided data for studies about the psychological dynamics that develop when one family member becomes the primary financial
provider without receiving appropriate recognition or appreciation. Marcus's business continued to grow and evolve, but his relationship with money became healthier and more sustainable. He learned to enjoy his success rather than viewing it primarily as a tool for managing other people's needs and emotions. His spending patterns shifted to reflect his own values and desires rather than his family's expectations and demands. The mansion in Beverly Hills became a symbol of the family's evolution, rather than a monument to Marcus's invisible subsidization. Family gatherings happened there as celebrations of mutual achievement, rather than opportunities for financial negotiation. The house that had once represented dysfunction and dependency became a place where healthy relationships could develop and flourish. Marcus's story demonstrated that sometimes the most loving action is the one that initially seems most cruel. By forcing his family to confront their dependence and develop independence, he'd given them the opportunity to discover self-respect and genuine accomplishment. The crisis that had begun with screams of hatred had evolved into relationships based on mutual respect and authentic affection. The final lesson from Marcus's experience was that financial boundaries are not barriers to love, but foundations for healthy relationships. When money becomes the primary connection between family members, it corrupts the emotional bonds that should sustain those relationships. By removing financial dependency, Marcus had allowed genuine love to develop between him and his family for the first time in their adult lives. Years later, when Marcus reflected on the decision to cut off his family's financial support, he realized that the action had been necessary not just for his own well-being, but for theirs as well. They'd needed to experience consequences for their choices, develop skills for independent living, and discover that they were capable of success without his subsidization. The Chen family story became proof that redemption is possible even in the most damaged relationships, but only when all parties are willing to acknowledge reality and work toward mutual respect. Marcus learned that being generous doesn't require being invisible, and his family learned that being loved doesn't entitle them to unlimited financial support. The mansion still stands in Beverly Hills, still beautiful and impressive, but now it represents genuine success rather than subsidized illusion. The family that lives there has learned to value each other for who they are rather than what they can provide. And Marcus has learned that his worth isn't measured by his utility to others, but by his own integrity and accomplishments. The security cameras that captured Marcus's final visit to the house as an unacknowledged owner also recorded his first visit as a respected family member. The difference between those two moments represents the transformation that's possible when love is allowed to develop without the corruption of financial manipulation and emotional exploitation. Marcus Chen's story proves that sometimes you have to lose your family to save them, and sometimes you have to stop being generous to start being loving. The parents who once screamed, "We hate you," learned to say, "We respect you." And the son who'd been invisible for 30 years finally became visible as the remarkable person he'd always been. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.